Good evening, colleagues. My name is Delilah Scamilla, and this is my older adult oral video presentation. Within this presentation, I will be discussing Erikson's psychosocial development stage number 7, which is generativity versus stagnation. I chose somebody who I admire and look up to for this project, and within the discussion, you will see why I admire her and look up to her. With that being said, let me introduce to you to my subject. Her name is Mrs. Edme Farrell. She was born and raised in the islands of the Philippines. She came to the United States in 1990. Prior to that, she was married and had 2 children. She went straight to college right after high school and became a nurse through the encouragement of her mother. Her mother always wanted to be a nurse, but due to their culture and their beliefs, once a female gets married and has children, that becomes her primary role, which doesn't allow for anything else to occur. But Mrs. Edme's mother wanted more for her, and so she made sure that Miss Edme got her education prior to getting married and was a nurse when she did get married. So I'm just going to talk just a little bit about Erikson's definition of generativity versus stagnation, which is a stage within our lives where adults are invested in their family, their future generations, their work, and their community. A crisis that we have to overcome within this stage is self-absorption. A unfavorable outcome, it can be concern for self only, but it's not limited to that. A favorable outcome is the concern for family and society in general. So within Mrs. Edme's life, she always wanted better for her children's future. So she made huge sacrifices in her life to make sure she provided her kids with those opportunities. And in doing that, she actually had to make decisions that affected her tremendously. So, like I mentioned to you before, Mrs. Edme was married at a very young age, mid-20s to be specific. She lived with her husband's family and was actually ridiculed by her mother-in-law because in the Philippines, nurses in general is not a profession that is looked up to. Within her community, farmers are the ones who are looked up to. And according to her mother-in-law, Mrs. Edme should have just conformed to being a farmer's wife and helping out with the family business and becoming affluent within the farming community. And Miss Edme's conflict was that she already had this degree. She had gotten her education to become a nurse, and she felt like she had an obligation because she was not going to allow that education to not mean anything in her mind. So she did what she went to school for, which is nursing. And that was a conflict between her and her mother-in-law that Mrs. Edme had to resolve. So Mrs. Farrell chose to leave her family, of course, with her husband's permission, to seek better opportunities in the United States. She was presented with this opportunity in 1990, where there was a shortage of nurses in the United States, and the United States actually was recruiting in different parts of the world, in different countries, for nurses to come here to try to amend that shortage of nursing. Mrs. Edme she struggled with this decision because within her culture, like I stated before, being a mother and a wife, those are the primary roles that people aspire to or conform to. And Mrs. Edme felt like she wanted more. And she knew she had to make a sacrifice in order for her to create those opportunities, not only for herself, but for her family as well. Although her husband was hesitant in the beginning, he allowed Mrs. Edme to come to the United States. And with that within itself was a challenge, not only for him, but for Mrs. Edme, of course, because the love that they shared and the family that they already had begun. So Mrs. Edme felt conflicted, but she also knew that she didn't want to be in a negative environment where she's constantly ridiculed for what she went to school for. So I think that ridicule prompted Mrs. Edme to decide to come to the United States. And that decision really paid off, not only for her, but for her immediate family as well. So the decision to come to the United States allowed her to work here, and within a year's time, she was able to save enough money to send for her husband and her children. Eventually, they were able to purchase a house and make it a home. And they actually took it a step further and created this business of a restaurant, a family-owned business, a family-owned restaurant that provided, a service to her community. So going back to Erikson's generativity model, this epitomizes that. She not only provided for her immediate family, but she provided for the community at large. So this is why I think that choosing that stage specifically was perfect for her, because like I stated before, she's just the epitome of generativity. So although she found herself conflicted with her cultural beliefs and her role as a mother, and that struggle between her mother-in-law and her, I think that dynamic within that family allowed her decision to come to the United States a little bit more tolerable. Although she felt like she had to stay for her family, she also felt like she had to do this for her family. So you can see where the conflict is. But like I said, within a year's time, she was able to send for her husband and her 2 children. Within the ecological systems theory, which was recently renamed the bioecological systems, this theory defines an individual's development and it looks at their immediate environment, which I believe is Mrs. Edme's family, and the interaction of the larger environment, which I believe is, the creation of her family-owned restaurant and being able to service her community she lived in. So some of the components of the bioecological systems are discussed within Mrs. Edme's life. Mrs. Farrell was able to break boundaries. She decided to differentiate herself and maintain an equilibrium between her family, her business, and her profession. She superseded her role as a mother and a wife. She even provided a service for her community and with her family-owned restaurant. And within doing that, she also created opportunities for her children. She was able to send all three of her children, as a matter of fact, to college. So the two oldest children went to nursing school, and the youngest is in college now. I'm not sure what her major is. But as you can see, as a woman in a very limited culture for females, Mrs. Edme was able to break the mold, quote unquote, and become a progressive woman in her era. Although she was conflicted by many decisions that she had to make in her life, I believe that she made the right decisions that allowed her success and her family success. So, this is one of the reasons I admire her and look up to her. And I often go to her for advice when it comes to my nursing profession. Limitations that I found within the theories that we studied, or that I studied. Although Erikson's psychological development does not mention how cultural differences affect stages of development, you can easily see how they do. It being from a Latin culture myself, we do have limitations as women on what we should do and shouldn't do. And being the matriarch of my family, I actually broke that mold as well, but it was in a different sense because I had to. But that's not the discussion now. Another limitation that I saw within the Erikson model is that it doesn't really differentiate between the gender roles at each developmental stage. So, and it's interesting because literature lately has shown that females do tend to mature at a faster pace than males. So it'd be interesting to see that study. Maybe develop a new theory or model that really exemplifies the differences between male and female, and also the impact of culture. These are the references that I used. There is an article that I studied for this class that actually did a study on women, and that article was the Facing the Future Generativity, Stagnation, Intended Legacies and Well-being in Later Life. That article discussed the stressors that women endure during the generativity versus stagnation stage. And it would be interesting to see, or even for myself to even start that study or do research on it and see what it results in. I would be interested to see more of that type of literature out within the educational system. That ends my presentation. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. I know I did. I really enjoyed interviewing my subject and really getting detailed information of her narrative. Thank you very much for watching this video and allowing me to share what I've learned.